Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I am Rebecca Winthrop. I am the director of the Center for Universal Education here at the Brookings Institution, and we're thrilled to have you with us today for this event, The Importance of Real Skills for an AI World. I am joined by a wonderful group of experts who we will call on in a minute. But first, I want to let you know, please send your questions if you haven't already done so at hashtag Real Skills for AI at Blue Sky or X, or you can email us at events@brookings.edu. We've already received a few when people registered, or actually quite a few, so thank you for that. So what is our subject today? Today we're talking about what are the underlying competencies and skills that we think will be unchanging in a world of AI. These are things like self-control, working memory, attention, cognitive flexibility, reflection, motivation, engagement, creativity. All of these things are important brain processes, internal processes that happen within students that allow them to learn to read, to learn math, that help them meet unexpected challenges or see others' perspectives or solve problems. So we know these foundational skills, what we are talking about as real skills, because we're following the American Superintendents Association framing around them, will be needed no matter what new technological innovation arrives at young people's doorstep and at teachers' doorsteps and at schools' doorsteps. This event is the third this year in our series examining generative artificial intelligence, very specifically generative artificial intelligence. Some people call it the new AI, and children's learning and development. The first two, we looked at things like what it means for equity and access between low income and high income communities. We also looked at AI companions and what AI means for children's socialization and emotional development. And this session, we're really looking at the question of, what are some of those core competencies, learning capabilities, and skills young people will need to thrive in an AI world, and I would say continue to need to thrive in any world. And we are building off of a recent event that the American Superintendents Association hosted called a summit here in DC called Real Skills for Real Life, part of which they were advancing their public education promise that has 5 core commitments, the second one being real skills for real life. And I will let our panelist, John Malloy from AASA, talk about that. But a number of us were involved in that discussion and convening. And so we wanted to share some of our discussions and takeaways with all of you. So with that, I'm really happy to invite our moderator and panelists on the screen. John Vallant is leading us in a discussion today. He is the director of the Brown Center for Education Policy here at Brookings and one of my close colleagues. And he's also a senior fellow in governance studies. And we will be having a discussion and then turning it over to your questions. And I'm sure it will be quite a lively affair. John, over to you, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for joining us. It's really a privilege to get to moderate this session, and that's partly because at the heart of this session are some genuinely timely, important questions. And I think there are a lot of educators right now, there are a lot of policymakers, there are a lot of people who are feeling tugged in different directions, where on one hand, it's very clear the world is changing, and I think a lot of us have a sense we want to make sure we don't leave kids behind by not preparing them for whatever future we're headed to. And then on the other hand, feeling this pull in the direction of, well, there are some sort of timeless, durable skills that always have been valuable and probably always will be valuable. And we want to make sure we don't turn away from those. So really, that's sort of the question at the heart of this discussion is what lies ahead and how do we need to keep preparing students. And so I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll start a moderated Q&A, and then toward the end of the session, we'll do audience Q&A. And as Rebecca mentioned, we have some questions, but would love more. And if you'd like to send them, you can send questions now to events@brookings.edu or hashtag #RealSkillsForAI on X or Blue Sky. So to our panel. We have with us today Ellen Galinsky, who is the co-founder and president of the Families and Work Institute. Ellen also serves as a senior research advisor to the School Superintendents Association, and her research is focused on work life, child and adolescent development, youth voice, child care, parent-professional relationships, and parental development. And Ellen also was a parent expert and friend of Mr. Rogers, which you will find if you take a look at her bio online. We have Mary Helen Imerdino Yang, who is a professor of education, psychology, and neuroscience at the University of Southern California, and the founding director of the USC Center for Effective Neuroscience Development, Learning, and Education, or CANDLE. Mary Helen is a widely published scholar who fuses qualitative interviews with brain imaging and psychophysiological recordings to help us better understand adolescent development. And I think Mary Helen was a middle school teacher, too. And then we also have John Malloy, who is the Senior Vice President of the Leadership Network at the School Superintendents Association. And prior to his work at AASA, John served as the superintendent of the San Ramon Valley Unified School District in California. And prior to that, as the Director of Education, which I think is essentially superintendent for the Toronto District School Board, which I'm told John is a diehard fan of the Toronto Blue Jays, which has a special relevance today because the World Series starts tonight. So I'm going to start you all off with the same question. Rebecca, I'll ask you to go first if you would. But kind of big picture, I'd like to get a sense of how you see the world is changing with respect to what students need to know or be able to do. And so, do you see that the job market and the society that today's students are entering is going to value different skills or knowledge or dispositions than what has been valued in the past?
Mm. Oh my gosh, such a hard question. So we, John, as you know, because you're on our AI task force steering group, so we here at the Center for Universal Education have been undertaking a big global study through our Brookings Global Task Force on AI and Education, looking at, what are the risks, what are the benefits, how can you mitigate risks and harness the benefits of AI for children's education. We're really looking at students sort of early grades through end of secondary. And this question comes up a lot. Like, what do students need to know? What do they need to do? What's going to happen? So one of the things that we have been thinking a lot about is, is this a big change or is this a little change in terms of the external environment? I would say, certainly from my perspective, this is a big change. I think generative AI qualitatively is very, very different from the predictive AI that came before it, that has been used in adaptive learning, in part because we are using all of a sudden our own language to communicate with the machine. Before you had to go and learn, program languages. Another piece is the sort of, connection with emotional connection that's sort of large language models in particular, and the products that are designed around them are able to generate with people, particularly children, whose brains are developing, and they might not always know what is, real in real life or fictional online. So these are big, big changes. I personally talk about it as, in terms of seismic change for education, the printing press, the internet, and generative AI. I think it's along that same line in terms of how it's going to influence our teaching and learning strategies in schools around the world. Again, because so much of what we end up doing in schools is often, task completion, which these models are really, really good at. And you worry about sort of outsourcing all of that sort of learning exercises. Can kids just really easily hack and get around it? So that's how the world is changing. And the question you pose is one we're still grappling with. Like what, you know, what do kids need that is different and what do they need that is the same? I think, and I'm excited to hear what everybody else says, that kids will need a big chunk of what they've always needed. Again, what we're calling real skills for real life, some of these sort of foundational abilities, like I mentioned at the beginning, cognitive flexibility, reflection, motivation, engagement. We need to help young people develop those. I also think they're going to um, need a lot of sort of interpersonal social skills, and they're probably going to need a lot more oracy skills. I think in most education systems around the world, we've really indexed literacy on the two legs of the literacy stool, the reading and writing, and left out speaking and listening, frankly. And that is actually going to become more and more important. And then I think there's probably a host of other types of competencies and skills that you could trace back to other big technology shifts, but are related to understanding and navigating AI, including sort of understanding the ethics behind it. That's where I'm landing. Curious what others think.
Rebecca, thank you. John, I'm going to come to you next. So from Rebecca, I'm hearing the world is changing in really fundamental ways, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everything that students learn will change in a sort of corresponding one-to-one way. John, can I ask you the same question? So how are you seeing the world is changing, and then how are you seeing the skills and competencies that students need as changing in response?
Well, I agree with Rebecca. The world is really changing. And in light of that, I think public education, public schools will now be demanded to do things differently. What do I mean by that? We've been talking about real skills in the 4 decades that I've been in public education. And yet, when we look at what goes on in many classrooms, we are still honoring memorization, holding on to facts, and taking tests. Now, I'm not suggesting that's in every classroom across the entire country and beyond, but clearly we have said that our kids need to think and create and collaborate. They need to be able to focus and strategize. They needed to minimize distraction and work together to create something new. That has always been at the foundation of what we are in public schools. So I'm not thinking that that needs to change, but what needs to change is we're held accountable in public schools for a knowledge-based reality, which helps those of us, like me, who knew how to do school really well. I liked the affirmation of a teacher saying, sit, listen, and then give back to me what I shared. Now, that model, which dates back many, many decades, is what will now have to change because with AI surrounding us, our kids have access without necessarily needing that skill. Now, let me be very clear. Our kids need to read. They need to write. They need computational skills. Academics are not unimportant. They still are a focus. But that's not enough. And the way we're assessing those academics is not enough. So what I think now is the call to action is that we've been talking that we want to change, and we've seen pockets of that change throughout our country. But if we don't move that to scale, our classrooms aren't going to make any sense. And Rebecca made a really important point that AI will never take away our ability to relate to one another, our ability to be compassionate towards each other, our ability to be in relationship with each other so that we can be contributing citizens in communities that are healthy and well. I don't know what AI is actually going to do because we don't know everything. We know many things, but not everything, which is probably a challenge we can talk about later. But those human skills, which is very much a part of real skills, frankly, are the foundation for all good learning anyway. And Mary Helen will probably talk about this because I'm still inspired by her talk last week at our summit, where we're about helping young people develop, not just as an outcome, learn facts. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. And in a minute here, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you for some kind of concrete recommendations for how we can do that and how we can do better. But before that, Ellen, I'm going to hand off to you. So how do you see the world is changing and the demands of students is potentially changing with it?
Thank you, John, and it's quite a thrill to be here with you and to tackle the issue that's on everyone's mind wherever I go. Um, I do a kind of research called civic science, which is I don't assume I know the answer to the problem without knowing what the problem is, as seen by the people who are experiencing it. So I do research where I ask the children, I ask the youth, and I want to share, just really totally in the middle of analysis findings from an ongoing study we started in 2019. The kids are now 11 to 24, where we ask kids about their challenges, and I think it reflects both what Rebecca and John are saying. The first thing that they said, the question was, what are your major challenges growing up? 31% of them said relationships, So we could look at that in the old way. That could be like peer pressure. But this world, this AI world, this technology world is kid culture. And a number of them also said, we don't know how to socialize. Kids don't hang out very much. We need to learn how to be with other people. The second thing that they said, and that was 31%, 20% of them said workload pressure. I felt like I was doing research on work and family life, the way they talk. We've got too much to do. But the world of AI is compounding that, because the too much to do also includes the demands that technology, not just sports, not just school, not just friends, but AI is making on them. And it's hard to feel like they can ever finish, the way adults have talked about this for years. Another 12% talked about needing real life skills, and I'm going to get back to that in a moment. 9%, only 9% mentioned directly, when this is an open-ended question, mentioned technology. And when they did, they talked about it like feeling overloaded. And that goes along with what teachers are saying. In a recent study, 75% of K through 12 teachers talked about kids needing to learn to focus. Okay, so if I go back to kids talking about real skill, and also another thing that kids said is, don't blame everything on technology, you adults, you think it's all bad, it is the way it is. And when they talk about real skills, they are talking about this wanting to feel prepared for the world that they're going into after school, after they finish school. And most of them, it ranges, but about, in our latest study, not very many kids felt prepared for this world. And what they want to do is to have the skills that help them have relationships, solve problems, think creatively, manage their time, and the things that they see in the adult world happening, but they know they aren't learning in school. So yes, John, we've talked about this forever, this research on executive function skills, which has been my focus for the last 25 years, is, at least 25 years old. But these are the underlying skills, the executive function skills that underlie real skills. And there are things like Rebecca talked about working memory, but they are using what you know, being able to use what you know. Thinking, you talked about cognitive flexibility, Rebecca. It is thinking flexibly. You talked about reflection, so it's pausing before you act, and using self-control. In every culture around the world, the demands may differ, our language bases may differ, the context may differ, but kids need not to go on automatic, but do what they need to do to solve a problem. And that's the essence of bringing together our social, emotional, and cognitive capacities. And they underline things like setting goals and understanding the perspectives of other people, communicating, collaborating, the things that we've talked about for a long time. Wanted to say one more thing quickly, we'll talk about it later, which is it's not just kids who are saying they need these real skills. In communities around the country, red states, blue states, purple states, portrait of a graduate statements are coming up with, we need these skills. They don't know what they mean. They don't know how to implement them. We'll talk about that. The question you're going to ask John later. Not only they're saying it, but businesses saying it. My favorite thing with business was to go to a cocktail party and they'd say, you don't train the people for the world that they live in. And that was before. That is really true now. The NACE study that has looked at what people are hiring for is they're hiring for this. They're not hiring for grade point averages. They're hiring for skills. And finally, science is saying that these skills underlie all learning and that they're predictive of life success as well as academic success.
Thanks, Helen. It's great to have data to put to some of these issues. And speaking of, so Mary Helen, you've done a great deal of work here, and I'd love to hear a bit about what you've been finding.
Yeah, sure. First, I just want to say thank you for inviting me into this conversation. It's really very timely, very important, and it's quite an honor to be part of it with my esteemed colleagues. So thank you. I thought the way I might start is by providing a kind of background for how developmentally to think about how you make sense of children's skills and judge which ones are relevant and not, which ones are going to be useful and not in an uncertain future, right? In a future that hasn't been invented yet. And remind us that the purpose of real skills for real life is not only or always or even mainly to build skills now that you're going to use later. That's a way to think about it. But I think the really critical way for educators to think about it is, how do the skills that we are developing in our young people here now help develop them as humans who will be adaptable and ready to engage with skill building no matter what comes their way later? So skills play a really important role, not just in their direct utility and applicability later, but also in the role that they play in development now. So the example I often use for this is, thinking about only skills that you're going to need later, right? You would advise parents of 8-month-olds to just, get your kid right out of crawling. You don't need crawling. You're never going to use that again unless you lose something under the couch, right? Like totally unuseful. Get up, get some shoes on, start running, start riding a bike. Those are going to be applicable real world skills. But what we know is that the act of grappling with controlling one's limbs and visual coordination together in a real world to move around in a space is critical for the brain and psychosocial and cognitive development that young people need to go through. So when we think about the skill profile for its developmental affordances, not simply for its direct applicability later, we get a new source of insight into how we want to think about skills like thinking, writing, handwriting, reading, things that might be seen as obsolete in an AI world, but that at second glance may have deep developmental affordances for the young people engaging with them. And it's really not just about what you know how to do when you get out of here, it's who you are, right? So circling back to what John said, which I really liked about, we really have to think about, who kids, what kids know now, what they're able to do now. I would add onto that, who kids are, who are they becoming? What does it mean to be a responsible, happy, productive, ethical citizen who moves through the world with dispositions that are civically oriented and that are helping you not simply to manage in the world we're going to have, but to invent the world that we need, right? And that's really what we're aiming at. And then to take it back again to the examples about what we're currently privileging, or I would say over-privileging in our standard educational settings, which are your ability to feed back what somebody else gave you, your ability to do that in a very quick, timely, maybe critical way, where you remanipulate elements quickly, which is all important to be able to do those things. But what we have left out of our conversations about education is that we are way over-privileging and thinking really only about certain aspects of memory and not other aspects that I would argue are absolutely central to the whole enterprise. So we are thinking a lot about what we call semantic memory, memory for stuff, for information, right? Procedural memory, memory for how to tie your shoes or how to solve a long division problem. Very important, right? And those are the kinds of memory that we are mainly testing in our system and supporting. But there's another kind of memory that is absolutely core to the way that human beings organize and bring together their semantic and procedural memories, their ability to do things and know stuff in the service of something else. And we call that autobiographical memory, the memory for having had the experience of being here, learning this, engaging in these thought processes together with those around me. And the subjective experience of thinking in patterns with other people turns out to be like the neurological hat stand on which all the knowledge and procedures get hung. How do you know what to use your Algebra 2 skills for, right? Because you've lived in a world, hopefully in really great math classes, right? We're sort of segueing into like, what does this look like? Where you've used your skills to calculate quadratic equations to help people do financial planning, for example, or to think about the future of investment portfolios, or to think about the ways in which certain decisions to vaccinate or not vaccinate may play out exponentially over time. When you're using your math to solve real problems, you experience the learning as a kind of journey in which you are bringing your academic skills to bear in the space of complexity. You're navigating and negotiating emotionally poignant, deep, complex issues that don't have simple answers. And you're experiencing that in a very active way, an agentic way, as you move through the world. And what our and many people's science is showing is that the act of experiencing the learning is what determines how those opportunities to have learned will shape how you build your potential into the future.
And actually, I'm gonna bounce the question that you just asked right back to you, if I can, Mary Helen, about what does this look like? So if we have, I think we have plenty of folks on this webinar who they work in schools, they work in school districts, they work in state departments of education. Like what can they do tomorrow or next week or next year?
Yes, no, that is absolutely the $1 million question, right? And the $1 million answer is a lot of things, but here's how you'll know what's going to work where you are, right? And first of all, there are fantastic models of this that we can come back to. I like to recenter educators on a central question, right? If you think about the neurology of learning and memory and development, emotion and the way you subjectively experience things is core to the way you're moving through the world and witnessing and having things happen is actually developing you moving forward. So you ask yourself, the litmus test for good education is to ask yourself, not just what emotions are happening here, frustration, happiness, fun, discouragement, right? That's important, but that's less important than the emotions. Asking yourself, what are the emotions here about? Do they pertain to mainly to outcomes, results, things that are going to happen or not happen? A little bit of that's okay, but is that the core focus? I would argue in many of our classrooms it is. Or alternatively, do the emotions that people are having in this space pertain to ideas? When emotions pertain to ideas, it signals to the educators that the opportunity to learn here is actually an opportunity to grow yourself through the learning opportunity. What this looks like, physics class. Are you studying how balls roll down ramps? Or are you actually studying this hidden force nobody can see that is the ability of matter to pull on itself? And it's the same thing that's making my feet stick to the ground and the moon make tides. And we are eliciting it here and using this as a specific example of something that is a powerful, huge idea about how the universe works. When you have the opportunity for kids to connect their daily opportunities to do stuff to big ideas, that's powerful. So you ask yourself, what are the emotions about here? Because if you think about it, whatever we are having emotions about is what you're thinking about. And whatever you're thinking about, you could be learning about. So step back and ask yourselves, what are the emotions the learners and myself as the educator, right, are having in this space? What do they mainly pertain to? And that is a litmus test for the switch into an education system that focuses on learning for development as compared to learning for its own outcome to stop there, which might or might not be useful. You're leaving it up to chance whether the learner can actually take that stuff that they have learned, stored, remembered, done, and build it into an adaptable model for the future. And for too long, we've left that for kids to struggle with. And I would argue, just before I stop, that our systems, our standard systems, don't just under support a young person's development of capacities and proclivities to take what they're learning and connect it to big ideas and questions agentically and to emotionally move through the powerful space of knowledge building. We actively punish it. We teach kids, do not ask why we're learning this, how else you could think about this history, how else you could interpret this novel, what else you could be writing about, painting about, dancing about. That is really central to how you're making meaning. We ask kids to hide that side of themselves in the service of simply complying with what we have predetermined is necessary for them to ingest. Even if we know that we need them to take this knowledge in, what we need to do is set it up in a way that kids understand why they need it. If they're asking you, why are we doing this? That's a litmus test, another one for the fact that the curriculum was not well set up.
Could I jump in? Because I think, Mary Helen, you are pointing out so beautifully what's not working and what could work. And what's not working is that we've separated out emotion from so-called learning, where in your research, emotion drives learning. And I think that that's a critical thing. Another thing that we've done is that we've fixed things for kids, and we haven't helped kids learn to fix things for themselves. So I would say, what else should we be doing? We should be giving them things that they learn, problems that they learn to solve for themselves, because that's what they're asking for in the real world. They're not asking to just what the right answer is. They know that it's a complex and confusing world. So no to the digital literacy course, and you've done it. But yes to infusing this all the way through education, which is what John and I and AASA are trying to do, is to infuse this all the way through education. And yes to engagement. Rebecca, this is right to you, but we've ignored, in the business world where I've done lots of research, engagement is key. And that's what you're talking about, Mary Helen, too. Rebecca, you've just moved us yards beyond in terms of thinking about how we should think about engagement.
Let me just add one tiny add-on to what you said, Ellen, which I love, is that we also need to think not only about what do we give kids that will engage them, but how do we teach kids to engage themselves?
Yes.
How do we orchestrate an environment and invite them into the complexities of the world in the service of learning and finding things out? Because when we position kids to figure out for themselves what the problems are, that is deeply motivating and is conducive to much deeper understanding and exploration.
Rebecca, for a little bit of context, Rebecca is the author of a terrific new book called The Disengaged Teen that really is getting at some of these questions. And Rebecca, I'm curious to again situate this from the perspective of, if you're working in a school or you're working for a school district or a state, what can you do? How can we do a better job of engaging students, whether it's teens or anyone else?
Yes, happy to share. So my co-author, Jenny Anderson, and I spent a long time, 3 years, talking with students, following students, interviewing teachers, partnering with our nonprofit Transcend, and doing big surveys and whatnot. And ultimately, we found that the sort of current discourse around student engagement is too shallow. It's not super, it's engaged versus disengaged. Kids are engaged or they're disengaged. And kids showed up differently, actually, depending on the context. A lot of kids were in what we call passenger mode, where they're literally physically there, going through the motions, but they're not actually there emotionally. They don't care what they're learning. They're not really cognitively engaged. They're not emotionally and cognitively engaged. They're coasting. But they might look engaged to educators because it's actually quite hard as adults, educators, or family members to see what's going on inside kids unless you talk to them and ask them. Then you've got kids who are in achiever mode. These are the kids who are trying to get gold star in everything. And in many ways, they're developing great, organizational skills, study skills, goal orientation, but are often very fragile learners because they're doing what Mary Helen said. Their emotions actually are all about what they get at the end. Like, they're not that interested actually in the learning journey. It's, am I going to get an A? Am I going to be captain of the football team? Am I going to, win this debate club? Whatever it is, because they have perceived that school is a series of stars to get on the path to sort of getting acceptance to a good college is usually how it's framed, and it's not their fault. It's it's society that has given them that idea. There's nothing wrong with these kids, but they end up being quite fragile if they run into a problem, and they love being told what to do. The thing that they most said frustrated them, if kids were really stuck in achiever mode, was when teachers didn't tell them exactly what to do to get an A, which is not the skill we need for a world of AI. Then you've got kids in resistor mode who are disengaged on all fronts. This is sort of the typical problem children, but they have quite a bit of agency. They're disrupting class, they're refusing to do homework, they're taking long bathroom breaks, they're actually exerting their agency inappropriately. But it does signal. This is another signal. Mary Helen, put out signals. If kids are doing this, it does signal that they are not motivated. They don't find the meaning. They don't feel safe. They don't feel belong. There's a suite of reasons to really engage in their learning, and that's helpful because their agency is pointed away from learning. But they were able to switch much more quickly to this explorer mode, which is exactly what Mary Helen's talking about. It's when the context around kids lets their curiosity meet their drive, and they can really become unstoppable. And there's lots of research to say that when you're in explorer mode, your academics don't suffer. In fact, your academics are better. And you have pro-social behavior, and you're interested in what you're doing, so you're enjoying school, so your mental health is better. And this explore mode is basically you have to give kids, so this is what we can do, help kids get more time in explore mode, which is you have to give them some choice. Kids get excited and in explore mode when they feel like they have a little bit of choice and autonomy. In the US, one of the studies we found, which was horrifying, was teenagers are subject to twice as many rules as incarcerated felons. And if you think about it, most schools, students have to ask when to stand up, when to talk, when to pee, right? Like there's many rules that kids are subjected to. A little bit of freedom, a little bit of choice, a little bit of autonomy, giving kids, there's a suite of things you can do in the classroom that actually doesn't shift at all your lesson plan. So if you're an educator or you run schools or districts and you're listening in, I would suggest looking at autonomy supportive teaching practices by John Marshall Reeve. It's well studied, and they're small shifts. Giving explanatory rationales, letting kids ask questions before you dive into a lesson about things they're curious about. There's also things we can do sort of at a policy sort of angle, which schools can do, and you don't need legislation for, which is make sure that kids get to stay involved in extracurriculars or clubs or anything they're excited or interested in, even if their grades slip. In a lot of schools, sort of maintaining a GPA, this is a well-intentioned rule by schools and parents often, is a requirement for being on the debate club or in the soccer team or in theater group or whatever it is. But really the requirements should be attendance, show up, and good pro-social behavior, no fighting, because the minute kids are starting to slip academically, they're looking for what Mary Helen is talking about, a place that they're excited to be, that they can feel like they can dig in, and extracurriculars and out of school activities often provide that. So any sort of robust support to that system is also going to be incredibly helpful to get kids into explore mode. And I should mention before we move on, we did find with our partners at Transcend that less than 4% of middle school and high school students said that they regularly spend time in school in explore mode. So there is room for growth.
Rebecca, looking at that through the lens of these new technologies, so yes, generative AI, but also cell phones and social media, do you think of there as being a sort of gravitational pull towards some modes that come from exposure to those technologies?
Right. We found that it all depends on how they're used and designed. So if you're using and AI is software, so it's embedded in social media. It's basically embedded in every platform. So it's all blended together now. But if you're on, let's say, on your phone on social media and you're just sort of doom scrolling, you're passive and you're not generating, it's also about sort of what they're feeling, what they're doing, what they're thinking. You're not sort of generating ideas. You don't feel enlivened and excited. That is definitely a tug towards passenger mode and passivity. Um, and there are times when kids are super in explorer mode on YouTube, learning how to do a skateboard trick, for example, over and over and over, or learning how to bake. That is explore mode. And I would say the problem is that most of the sort of design of let's just stick with social media, but also, I think LLMs, it's too early to say yet. You can say a lot of things about AI chatbots, but with social media, the design is very much towards passivity. It's designed to keep scrolling, going on to the next short clips, not sort of deep focused attention on YouTube. Keep going over and over on your same, video to learn about it, how to do your skateboard trick better, and then you go and try it and you look at it again. So that is part of the concern.
Thank you. And John, I promised I'd put you back on the spot, and I want to do that now. So I'm going to kind of present that same hypothetical, which I know for you actually at times in your career wasn't a hypothetical. So imagine you're leading a school district or you're leading a school, and you're trying to think, okay, so tomorrow or next week, what do we actually do if we think we've been positioned in the wrong way and maybe developing not the full set of skills that we should be developing?
Thanks, John. And I want to start by saying educators care about doing the best they can for kids. And we have educators across this country who are doing brilliant work. Our challenge, I'm going to pick up on Rebecca's point because I think it's actually the key. How do we give our educators space to help kids stay in the explorer mode? Educators can do this, but there are some challenges. So they know how to extend a lesson so the kids have voice and choice. They know how to ensure the kids are collaborating based upon what they're interested in. They know how to go deeper than what the curriculum standard demands. I have yet to meet a teacher who was unable to do this. So then you might say, well, then why is this transformation not happening? And that is where the systemic issues come into play. The biggest concern that educators have shared with us nationally and individually through my different leadership positions is we don't have the time to do everything you're talking about, explorer mode, and all the things, as I said earlier, we're held accountable for. Just take a look at headlines on internet or on paper, and what you see is districts being called great or not, schools being called successful or not, and it goes much further, educators being held to account by standards that are not necessarily explorer mode. But what we know from research is that explorer mode will actually take care of some of those quote unquote standardized academic expectations. But I have to tell you that educators across our country may not yet believe that. So one of the concrete steps we can take, and I've shared this everywhere I've gone since we've been working together on the real skills, is you can focus on the real skills. You can create the opportunities for explorer mode, which leads to the engagement which we're talking about. And your kids are going to be fine on some of those other things that we're held accountable for. The and is, how can we get our policymakers to engage us in this discussion? Because if we would change some of these metrics, we could actually bring about this transformation quickly. What I mean by that is academic skills, I will always say, are important. And if that's all we are measuring, and frankly, in a very memorize and give back approach, that transformation is not going to happen. Right now, as a superintendent for 15 years, I was never held accountable for assisting our educators to stay in explorer mode so that kids can engage in everything we're talking about. There are really no systemic metrics, even though over time, in my own experience, we would hold up for our community what we were doing and why. we would create our own metrics locally to show that we were moving in areas like creativity and critical thinking, for example. And we asked our community to hold us accountable to these things. But at the end of the day, the newspaper reports are still measuring something else. So in summary, educators will do what kids need, but we've got to give them the conditions to make that happen. The research on engagement, the explorer mode, and shifting education is really clear that it can bring about all kinds of good things. But then we have to help educators manage time, because not everyone believes that that will equate to the test that we're held accountable for. And so therein lies, I think, the rub that still needs to be worked through. And AI and the shift that's going on around us, I am completely hopeful is going to demand this change. 10 years ago, we talked about it. 20 years ago, we talked about it, but nothing demanded the change like today. At least that's the optimistic side of me talking.
The other thing that I find, and over to you, Mary Helen, in a second, is that teachers don't know about the brain, that while they know the right things to do, our summit made it very clear that teachers don't know about the brain development of early childhood and adolescence. They were blown away at the summit when they heard the best researchers from the United States and other parts of the world talk about brain development. And so they moved from thinking of reading, writing, and arithmetic to reading, writing, and arithmetic and real skills. But I think that there's a business case to be made also with educators so that they understand things like Explorer Mode, like what you're doing with Transcendent Thinking, Mary Helen. Anyway, you wanted to explain some of the neurological perspectives.
Yeah, no, that's right. I'm going to kind of riff off what you just said, Alan, and also John, and also maybe add a little bit of context to what you're saying, John, about what teachers know how to do. So we actually went into classrooms all around Los Angeles, low SES communities with high levels of street violence and things like that, and went into high schools and junior highs that were public and serving large proportions of low SES kids of color, and asked the administrators, who are your superstars? Who are your superstar teachers that you think are really great? Can you point us to them? And we invited 40 of those amazing individuals to come back to the lab with us to engage in a multi-phase study. All of them agreed. They're just like amazing human beings. And that study involved an outside team of observers actually observing those teachers in the classroom and rating what they're doing in terms of things like voice and choice, equitable access to information, depth of content that's being expected for kids to engage with, all the core things about education that we know are important. And then and with psychophysiological recording, which is also interesting. So how are teachers actually socially managing their physiology in a way that co-regulates others to settle into a safe space to think in? And we find that kids notice that. Outside observers there for an hour didn't pick up on it, but the kids who were in those classes did report to us that teachers with certain abilities to calm themselves physiologically and engage were actually being perceived as more effective by the kids. So that's interesting. But then we also brought the teachers back to the lab, and we did in-depth interviews with them about how they understand their work. We asked them things like, how do you think about voice and choice in your classroom? How do you think about depth of content? How do you think about equitable access to information? And what we found is that every one of these teachers was deeply, deeply committed to working their tails off on behalf of these kids they deeply cared about. And there was a huge range of skill and expertise amongst those teachers, which was uncorrelated with the number of years in the classroom, in which they described for us how they understood these things in ways that varied very much along a continuum of developmental knowledge, is what I'm calling. Teachers who were at what I would call the low end of the developmental knowledge, and again, these are teachers who are, in some cases, they're working even harder because they're jumping around and really entertaining and really planning everything and giving kids stuff and expecting it back and following up. And first of all, those teachers told us they were exhausted and stressed, right? Because they're worried that their kids are this close to falling off the track, getting into prison, doing stuff, and they see themselves as the person between the kids and the world, keeping them safe. Whereas the teachers on the other end of the spectrum who deeply understood the developmental possibilities and potentials of young people, and I'll tell you what that looked like in a second, were not as stressed because they were saying, my job is to invite these kids to become who they want themselves to be. I'm setting up a world for them and I'm feeding them feedback on how they do that. I'm providing them with opportunities, rich opportunities to engage in meaningful work around meaningful problems and projects and collaborations in the community and in the school that they very much are invested in. And then my job is to support that. And so, what we saw is that teachers at what we call the low end of the developmental knowledge spectrum were saying things like, when we asked them to give real-time feedback to their students, like, here's your student, Mary Helen, what would you say to her? They said things like, Mary Helen, I follow you, I bug you, I ask you to please, like, do your homework. I can't help you if you don't do it. I'm like, or alternatively, and I'm almost quoting these students, Mary Helen, you're just a model student. You always do your homework and you advocate for yourself and you do what you're supposed to do. I do wish you would push yourself a little more because I think you could do more, but you're just great. Keep going, right? Teachers at the other end of the spectrum were saying things like, Mary Helen, you've got amazing ideas, but I want to see you develop your intellectual courage. How do you do that? You're going to start to actually put your ideas out there in a conversation. You're going to share them and you're going to be brave. And then you're going to sit back and wait to see what your classmates think of them. And then you're going to reflect on that and you're going to respond. And as you do that, Mary Helen, you're going to be developing that muscle of intellectual courage. I want you to work on that, right? Or another teacher who said, Mary Helen, I think you get to a place in your work where you just stop. You say, I'm done. I give up, right? And what you need to do is learn to think more things. That's a skill, actually, they said. Let me tell you how you start. You listen to other people's opinions and then you reflect. What do you think of those? And then you give yours and then you reflect. And meanwhile, now you're engaging with information. Then you go read something about it. You bring it back. You maybe look on, the internet and AI and you bring that back and then you think and then you make a new opinion and then you revise your opinion. And there you go. You're thinking, right? Those teachers were focusing on the developmental capacities and proclivities to think, rather than on helping and making kids get their stuff done. Of course, you have to get your stuff done in order to think about the stuff, but that just gets embedded in the narrative. What we also found, which is incredibly cool, is we could see this in the teachers' brains, God love them, when they got on the scanner and graded their students' work. The more developmentally oriented a teacher was when they were grading their students' work, the more activity they were showing in social and affective and cognitive regions and planning and attention and autobiographical memory as they were engaging with their own students' work compared with work from students they don't know, right? Where they graded them the same way, but in the one case, they know the kid and they're bringing all this developmental knowledge to bear. Okay. What's going on in the brains of kids and teachers and all human beings when we engage in this kind of thinking? You can sort of think about the network properties of the brain, the dynamics that are actively being engaged. The brain is really like a muscle. You grow it by using it. So the question is, how are you using your brain? Not what can you put in and out of it, but what is the process by which you are engaging in thinking and feeling about information, right? And what we found, and many, many studies in neuroscience are backing up the development of these networks. And what we were able to do is link them to these dispositions of mind, in this case, in high school students. And these dispositions predicted the future development of their brain, right? Structural, the actual physical growth, and functional, how it was activating itself just at rest when we left kids in the scanner for 10 minutes and said, hey, think about whatever you want. Don't fall asleep. We could see that there was more active coordination just when you were allowed to think about whatever you wanted. And then that in turn predicted how much kids liked themselves as young adults, how good they reported their relationships were, how satisfied, how much they thought whatever they were doing in school or work was what they had always hoped for themselves, and they were really achieving at it by their own metrics. What was it that they were doing? They were showing us in real time when we gave them complex things to think about and asked them, how do you feel about this? What do you think about this? They were showing us sort of two modes that correspond and undergird very nicely the ones that Rebecca talks about in her book, right? And they actually describe, she and Jenny describe some of this work as sort of the underlying features of what this looks like behaviorally to teachers that they describe so nicely, right? You're moving almost like a seesaw. There's nothing sloshing back and forth in the head, just want to be clear. But it's like the dynamic networks are activating while others are deactivating. And what is the pivot that decides? It's visceral somatosensation. It's the feeling of your own guts and consciousness and internal organs. I'm feeling me, and I'm engaging with paying attention out here. I'm tipping my seesaw this way, and I'm gathering information, and I'm doing, and I'm watching the clock, and I'm moving my pencil on the paper, right? And that's kind of externally focused attention, extremely important. And it's the kind that social media is hijacking oftentimes. Like, I need more, I need more, I need more. I'm going to keep tipping out here because what I'm getting is every time I get a little like that I want, right? Or something that, entertains me. And what we found, though, is that kids who agentically of their own accord then stepped back, and we actually show in adults and teenagers that they might close their eyes, they might cover their face, they might look down, they close their posture, they appear to withdraw, but what they're actually doing is reflecting on and building a bigger understanding of ideas that are not directly observable in the here and now, that are about the bigger picture, the synthesizing, the integrating, the ethical deliberations about the historical context, the possible futures, right? You're imagining, you're building narratives, and you're inventing things that don't exist, like ideas, like gravity. And what we showed is that kids are actively tipping the seesaw the other way into networks of the brain that are incompatible with external attention, right? Think about it. If you're out in the middle of playing a soccer game, you're running around and you're like, watch the ball, watch the goal, but you don't stop and muse about the affordances of Title IX for girls' sports. You're going to get hit in the head with a ball, right? You need to appropriately engage in playing the game, let that go, and reflect on the bigger systemic ideas. And what we found is that doing this, neurologically speaking, was deeply emotionally motivating to kids. And they were telling us so in real time from the scanner by pushing buttons to say how emotionally engaged they were. And over time, the act of doing that both built deeper understanding and knowledge and a sense of self connected to that knowledge, right? Kids were saying it felt like me thinking about math. It felt like me being a scientist. And as they think about the science in the context of tipping the seesaw, what you're doing is tickling up the guts and viscera and the actual literal neurobiologically me. And now here I am as an engaged thinker moving myself back and forth. What does this look like in schools? It looks like kids having the agency and the opportunity and the encouragement, like those teachers from our study, to think about what you're doing and the big ideas, to move yourself. I'm working on this. Wait a minute. Let me think about how this is going. Do we need to reformulate our plan? Do we need to reflect on somebody else's perspective? Maybe there's a better idea. Now come back and dig in. And doing that is growing their executive functioning to both activate it and deactivate it in order to be able to think what we're calling transcendently, to move beyond the immediate, to think about and situate what you're doing here in the immediate in a bigger, broader idea, identity, possible future, and then getting it done, having the self ability to buckle down and get it done. And those things are built by the person using them, not by somebody else or a system coming along and forcing them to. We need to orchestrate our systems so that inherently kids are building skills and dispositions for engaging in these ways. I'll just say last is that every kid in our sample from inner city Los Angeles, regardless of IQ, and there was a broad range of IQ, all normal functioning in the sense of being neurologically normal, but a broad range of IQ. We measured it, right? Broad range of socioeconomic status, a broad range of ethnic groups, kids from multiple, from different both sexes, right? And what we found is that none of that stuff correlated with the disposition to do this. All kids did it, at least some. The more they dispositionally did it, the more they grew their brain over time, the happier they were as young adults. And what that really tells us is we need to build education systems that do what this panel's talking about by giving kids the encouragement, the support, and the deep knowledge to teachers to know what it looks like. I would argue that a lot of teachers, even in our city, didn't know what it looks like. They think that kids need to be told what to do in order to make sure they don't screw up. Instead, that's partly true, it's not entirely untrue. But what's even more important is that teachers learn to orchestrate environments that invite kids to think and feel in these ways, that the teachers themselves are modeling and demonstrating this, and that becomes the underlying metric and purpose of the educational space. That's when we're going to get there.
Yeah. So let's talk about how to do that. And I'm hearing a couple of, and John, I'm going to come to you here in a second, but I'm hearing a couple of different things. So some questions about systemic issues, and my ears hear policy because I'm a policy person, about what might we do on the policy side. I'm also hearing where there is this spectrum of developmental knowledge in teachers. There's the part of me that wants to know how we can help more teachers get to the right side of that spectrum, and is that teacher preparation, or what can we do? And John, I'll maybe ask you to take a run at that.
Thanks, John. And I think that I'm appreciating, Mary Helen, everything that you're saying. Until recently, we also have to name, when you talk about cultures and systems, when kids were learning in the way that we're talking about right now, that was actually called alternative ed. Up until recently. Now we're broadening that, but it's just recent because there's the academic track that's defined in a certain way. And then there's the alternative tracks, which frankly, when kids get into them, if that's what they desire, the outcomes are so much different. Similarly, we talk about arts and sports. And any of us who are part of that as young people, and still to this day, talk about taxing your brain and practicing all the skills we're speaking about, and we call them extracurricular. These are not big shifts if we can also do another important thing. And this is where I spent a lot of my time as a superintendent. We all went to school. And sometimes we want school to be like it was when we were in school. Even some of our families who might be in the business world and understand everything that goes on there still hold that academic track tightly. So we've got policy expectations that hold the academic track in a certain way. We have family expectations that hold the track in a certain way. We have post-secondary destinations, still unfortunately relying on grade point averages and such, that hold the track in a certain way. And I'll never forget this. My second last year in my last district, a young person stopped me in the hall when I was visiting their high school and said, "I've got the best GPA. I got the college that I wanted, but I'm not ready." And I asked him to unpack that for me, and he explained, and it's everything we're speaking about here. So I actually think that what is the moment we're in, again, a little bit of optimism, we need our policymakers to understand what we're speaking about. And at our summit last week, what I appreciated about all the researchers, including Mary Helen and Rebecca and Ellen, is take all this brilliant work you've done for decades, and would you distill for us what you think we need to know?
Working on
And
it.
the educators in the room were on fire with excitement because we were like, we can do that. We can do that. That's doable. That's not that difficult. So research informing policy, that policy then holding us accountable for some different things. Then we get to work with our families regarding what public education should be for your child and why. Because the other thing AASA has studied, and we have this data, our families want their kids to be ready with the real skills. They're asking for it. We've got the data through all kinds of focus groups and studies we've done, and yet there's still this unbelievable obsession with knowledge-based, content-driven, set and get approaches. So my thought would be we need a little bit more impetus. And again, the AI world is probably going to drive it. And I think we can support our educators because we can prepare them not to do multiple things, which is what we expect of them right now, get them ready for the test and all of these wonderful things we're talking about. We can actually prepare them for the kind of experience all of our kids would benefit from. So that's kind of what I'm holding up as the optimism. And I think the time is now.
John, I would
I'm
love
sorry,
John,
to.
actually, can
real
I
quick, Ellen, I have a quick follow-up for John. I've heard
go
you
ahead,
say
John?
a couple of times that uh, you've mentioned accountability and sort of what we hold schools accountable for. And I think earlier I heard you say that you were never held accountable for getting kids into explorer mode. Can you talk more about that? And is that something that you see as being an ideal part of policy? Like, should we be thinking about ways of holding schools accountable for shifting kids' modes?
At the end of the day, research tells us what our kids need. For whatever reason, and it's decades and decades old, we're still held accountable for a very, very important but narrow part of that equation. If, as a superintendent, my test scores are in a certain place, I am considered a successful district. When I am an improving district, it's test scores that usually demand that. So when I say policy and expectation can drive a different kind of accountability, let me be really clear. There are many, many districts in this country right now. I work with a lot of them where they've created that portrait of a graduate. The community helped them arrive at those much broader skills. They've aligned their resources and their accountability systems locally, and they've supported their teachers aligned with that. And then when they're in a boardroom, which is the political space, those metrics are discussed as openly, if not more, than the state tests that we're all basically written up in the newspaper or on the internet about. So again, my thought is, I'm not suggesting those things are unimportant, but they're a part of the puzzle when at this point, they still are publicly pretty much the major puzzle. And for us to bring about the transformation, we need to give teachers time and space and permission with support to do things differently. And then we need to use different metrics to show that all that hard effort that they're doing with their kids is having different impacts. Because not all kids are going to do well on the standardized test, even if they are completely engaged in their learning in all the ways we've been talking about. So there's just a few thoughts.
Thank you.
John, I wanted to just jump
Please.
in and underscore what John Malloy just said, around giving teachers time and space. And part of that, I think, is building a case in the demand side amongst families and voters around why this is a good way to go. And I think, John, your observation, like we know parents and caregivers and families care about developing the whole child. That would be sort of the researchy, wonky way to say it. Parents talk about wanting their kids to be good people and wanting them to be able to know themselves and be able to chart their way in life. But I think that families have been given a short stick because and I put all of us and everybody else who works in education, myself included, in this bucket. We have poorly given them feedback and information around what we want them to care about. Because the main things families and parents get feedback loops around their kids' education around are their report cards and behavior calls home. That's like the bulk of it. So, I am hopeful. This is part of the reason we wanted to do the 4 modes, and we wrote the book heavily for educators, yes, but for parents. Like if we can have a new language and begin to give feedback loops around a broader set of things that is sort of tangible and concrete and accessible, I think it will hopefully build that demand side to support all the things you want, which I think is crucial.
John, I've been doing this for close to 20 years. That is working with educators and systems that want to change. And I've learned 2 things that I want to share right here. One is you have to start with the adults. You can't start with the kids. The adults need to learn these skills. They need to learn why they're important. They need to know how it feels to be an explorer themselves. They need to understand about kids' development. They need to see that they'll have a regulated class if they do this with not kids acting crazy, and they'll have kids learning, and they'll probably do pretty well on the test. In fact, usually very well. So the first thing is don't start with the kids. You've got to start with adults. And that's what we're doing with AASA, which is we're developing out of the summit a teacher training program with tools and skills to start with the adults. And that means the adults teachers, the adults school board, the adults superintendents, the adults' families. You can't send one missionary out there and think that the whole system is going to change. Number two, I think you need a mindset shift. And we've been exploring the notion that builds on Carol Dweck's work of a possibility mindset. We've discovered it in our own research, and a couple of years ago, we've been testing it. And just like teaching real skills to adults, mindsets can be taught. They can be changed and they can be taught. A possibility mindset means, one, that change is possible. That's Carol Dweck's, things won't change, things will change. The second part that's really important is whether you see something that's different as a challenge or a threat. And if you can lean into the challenge, we found this with people who are coping well, leaning into the challenge, understanding, don't try to make it go away and just do deep breaths and wish that it were different and, practice breathing and that stuff. But leaning into the stress and understand how stress mobilizes you and think of it as a challenge that you're going to be able to tackle it, and then feeling that you can figure it out, self-efficacy. We've seen, as we've been training teachers, that we can shift mindsets. We've just seen with mental health issues that a possibility mindset is correlated 0.64 with positive mental health. So I think we can teach this to kids. So I think that we have a good starting place. We're going to figure it out. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to try to do things differently as we explore this, all of us together. But I think in this time of transition with an AI world that I agree with John is wonderfully and frighteningly disruptive, I think that, and with the demand for real skills and with the science, I think we have an unparalleled opportunity to do things differently.
I'll just add
And
really
actually,
quickly that
no,
there are
please.
great examples of this going on. So Linda Darling-Hammond's work, especially the work she's leading at the Learning Policy Institute in California, is very much targeting the specific kinds of changes and kinds of institutional structural differences that are needed for teachers to be able to do this work this way. So there are people working on the policy side of it. And there are also school districts, large scale urban school districts that are doing this incredibly seriously and deeply and well. We're studying some of them. For example, Anaheim Unified School District in Southern California is one that has changed its whole model of teaching and learning, and is deeply engaging with new models of assessment around portfolios and projects, and new models of teaching, again, around designing entry points for kids to get into deep questions and problems that they're going to explore over time. So there are good examples of this happening in America's public schools.
And if I could just make one connection to Rebecca's comment that Mary Holland just made, because Mike Mitsuda in Anaheim has successfully, with his team, communicated with his community to honor different metrics.
Yes.
Like that's a perfect example where he has successfully, with his team, helped his entire community actually hold him more accountable for other things than what states would hold him accountable for. And he is totally articulate about that process. When Ellen and I, doing work with superintendents, are talking about this transformation, it's that playbook we're thinking about. How do we help leaders engage their communities differently so the Anaheim story that Mary Helen just spoke about is one that isn't just in some places, but can somehow move to all places?
Thank you. So we have some really thoughtful questions, and I want to make sure we're getting them in from audience. And I would say several of the questions are kind of roughly along these lines of what will AI do to children's creativity, to their critical thinking skills, and to some of the real skills that we're talking about now? So if we don't get out front, what happens? And then actually one question that resonates for me personally on this is how can we mitigate against becoming dumber while using AI? I think we have a lot of questions along those lines. And maybe Rebecca, if I can start with you on that, what will AI do to our students if we aren't thoughtful about this?
Well, we are in the midst. Collectively, the Brookings team, shout out to Mary Burns and Emma Benitez and everybody else on the steering group who's working on this, writing our findings up from our research on the AI task force. One thing is clear, that there's a range of ways kids are using AI, and let's stick just with chatbots, LLMs. some highly motivated kids in explore mode are dumping their um, notes from class in it and saying, can you make me a podcast so I can learn about this? Or can you quiz? I have a test coming up. Can you quiz me? And, being really creative on how they use it. These are kids who are super explore mode already. There's a lot of other kids. And remember, generative AI is entering a teaching and learning environment when 50% of middle school and high school kids are in passenger mode. So you have to think about the environment in which this new technology is showing up. There's a lot of kids who are, what we're really worried about is cognitive offloading, which is basically, hacking their assignments for AI to do them. And there's a cat and mouse game. Schools can ban certain technologies, they'll use other ones. A lot of kids are using it through social media because there's AI companions built off of ChatGPT or other LLMs embedded in Snapchat and Meta, and they can, send funny pictures, do their snap streaks, and take a picture of their math homework, upload it, and it'll do their homework for them. There's a whole bunch of AI humanizers. So in all our interviews, a lot of kids who do have access to AI and are using it say that they don't get caught. And so, I am worried. We are all worried about too much cognitive offloading. Oh, basically AI overuse, really diminishing just the basic ability and of kids to think and develop and learn. We're also worried about it undermining their self-efficacy. The other thing we see is false sense of accomplishment. So and we hear this again, we interviewed students and parents and teachers around the world, as well as many other experts. A lot of times we would hear teachers, but sometimes students saying, they put a little bit of something into an LLM, an essay came out and this is my essay. I did that. So, these are some of the things we're quite worried about, the sense of effortless learning, which learning is not, removing opportunities to actually push kids so that they do struggle and build all those neural connections that we're talking about, even if the assignments aren't great. So we are worried about it. I would have to say I'm worried about it making me dumber because I actually love generative AI as a research assistant, literature reviews, etc., like 24/7 intern. It's amazing. And copy editor. Now I'm really bad at copy editing my own work. I used to be not great, but I was okay. Okay. So I see it with, as personally, and I'm imagining what that does for kids. We will have our report out, which we will be able to share much more fulsomely our thoughts on this on January 14th. So,
John,
more.
I actually asked kids what schools could do to address the kind of questions that you just asked, and they said things like group assignments. They said discussion in class, not just asking question, getting answers, but having people think about it, an issue together and discuss it together, time for reflection. Things like, there are also anti-cheating things like paper and pencil tests and, and those sorts of things with no AI in the room. But I think that the kids were telling us when we were doing these focus groups, a whole lot of creative ideas to prevent them from getting dumber. And again, I just want to emphasize it's not going to be one digital literacy course. It really has to be embedded in we know about what it takes to have far transfer of these skills. That is, you learn the skills in one context and they transfer to another situation. And it means that they need to be embedded in everyday life in increasingly challenging ways where kids get practice. So it's really important that it not just be something over here like some little course and then you're supposed to have solved all the problems.
And an additional piece to this, very concretely, and I did this with groups of teachers, ask them to put their favorite assignment into ChatGPT and see what ChatGPT gives them. And then think about what does it mean for you to offer the young people a learning experience that actually would go beyond that. Secondly, when you talk about the whole human frame, at least at this point, ChatGPT and other AI models cannot get inside my heart and head in a way that will allow that reflection to take place. Thirdly, when kids get excited about practicing for a play or practicing for a sports team, even though they might get some ideas from artificial intelligence on what it should be, Ellen's point is a great one about what does practice look like in an engaging way. Again, ChatGPT or other AI models are going to give you lots of stuff, but there are things that it's not going to give you, especially as we talk about real skills being developed. So what does it mean for us to help teachers to think about that practice that's required, that AI will be able to do some things, but at least at this point, not all things?
I could pick up on that. So we have another question, and Ellen, I might start with you on this one. But I love this question, which is, what should I advise my grandchildren? And so I think, top of mind for a lot of people in this space now is this question of like, we encouraged a lot of people to get coding degrees, and now, we're maybe wondering, was that a good idea? Maybe it was a good idea. Maybe it wasn't a good idea. But so if you're thinking about, what do we tell kids who are trying to figure out, okay, how is my world changing and what should I do right now? So not teachers, not schools, but kids themselves.
Well, I'm a grandparent, so the grandparent question works really well with me. I would go first to a concept. I'll use Rebecca's word. I've talked about it forever. Help kids find their spark. So as a grandparent, and as a parent, I also felt that my purpose was to help my kids find things that they were really interested in. I did not read their grades on purpose. I never read their grades unless they told me that they wanted me to do it. My emphasis was always on helping them find the thing that they're interested in. When my now 12-year-old grandson got, I guess the nice word is addicted to games and stuff like that, we made sure that he had experiences that extended that. So he learned coding so that he could make, this is when he was younger, he could make things in Minecraft. And we turned him from a consumer to a creator. We tried to. And that really did a world of good. So if I was speaking to a group of parents the other day and they said, my kids have no other interests but games. Well, find something in the games that you can build the spark on and extend it. In terms of, I think that we want to give them lots of, John and I are working to help schools help kids have more real world work experience, but that's not the only solution to real skills. So I think that part of our lives too, as parents, as grandparents, as schools, is to introduce kids to the world of work. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but we do know that the people who have creative thinking and critical thinking and have interests are the kind of people that employers are looking for, particularly in an AI world.
We just had a question come in. This question's for John about what specifically the alternative metrics are that you were alluding to. So, like, what kinds of observable outcomes would you recommend that districts are held accountable for?
So, for example, in the well-being space, where we're talking about kids' engagement, their sense of belonging, their resilience in the face of challenges, which are all connected to what we're speaking about. Many states, like California, actually have some metrics that measure that in a trailing way, means after the fact, but there are also ways we can do it kind of just in time. And yet I was always surprised that data was not actually broadly talked about in the same way as our standardized test scores, for example. What other districts have done is, through that process of engaging the community on what is it we commit to you we're going to do for your kids in our school. So we decide, and they're all skill-based, by the way. We talk about portraits of a graduate or a learner profile or whatever the district calls it. They're always skills. They're not things. They're not numbers. They're not letters. And you can't give a kid an A, B, or a C, or a 90 or an 80% for any of those things that the community says, I want my kids to be critical thinkers, creators, and so forth. Many districts have done this. Then it's the district's job with their community to say, all right, we're going to measure it in these ways. Sometimes the measurement is through observation. Sometimes the measurement is through focus groups with kids. We've got to realize, the research world knows this. I'm only kind of like a novice researcher. I didn't do a lot, but I needed to do it for a doctorate, and that's it. But the research world can teach us other ways of measuring that we simply don't use. And then we can honor those ways of measuring by just engaging, Rebecca, as you said, the community about why. And then people will say, hey, why did your well-being data go down? I actually was never asked that, but I was certainly asked about other scores, which again are not unimportant. But I think if we're going to be accountable to more, we have to make commitments to the skills, a different purpose in some ways that people might think for public ed. And we need metrics to measure those. And we can look to experts who've done this for a long time. And that's one of the things, again, I loved about our summit. I had no concept about what a lab was until all of these wonderful researchers explained to us what they do in a lab. I know what a lab is, like a chemistry lab, but I didn't know what a lab looked like or sounded like in a social science, civic science space. We got access to that. And I thought, there's a ton of things that we need to learn from what people here on this call and others across the country already know.
Well,
Thank
one
you.
thing
And
that I think AI
yeah,
will
please.
be really useful for is what John talked about. There is a potential back office, not really very visible role for AI to really improve our ability to assess a range of kids' learning journeys across a range of dimensions. I think it's a promising area. There's a whole bunch of questions around privacy for students, and you need to figure that out. But it is an area to watch.
Thank you. And Rebecca, I'm going to give it back to you in just a minute here to sign us off. But before I do, I would love for each of the four of you just to share like 30 seconds on what you think are the most important takeaways. If you can maybe reflect on this conversation for a minute. And Mary Helen, if I could start with you, kind of biggest picture, most important takeaway.
Yeah, I think the most important takeaway is that what really is determining the impact school has on potentiating young people to be successful in the full way in which we mean it is not simply what they know. The act of learning and us measuring learning outcomes is really halfway there. It's extremely important, but it's the means, not the end of the education system. It's the means to something else, and the something else is the human development. What are the dispositions of mind? What are the ways in which kids show up in the world? How do they identify themselves as learners, as thinkers, as community agents, as members of society? And those are the ultimate things we need to be focusing on. And the learning is incredibly important because you need that backbone to have the complexity of dispositions of mind, but it's not the endpoint. Learning outcomes is a red herring. Developmental proclivities of youth is really where it's at.
Thank you. Don?
I'm sorry, I think you mentioned me. Yes?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Sorry, I didn't hear my name. I would say kids are amazing, and I mean that. Educators care to do the right thing, and we can support them to do that. We know so many things. We can make the complex a bit more simple and start to switch the system from the policy to the school to the families. And I think our kids will benefit from it.
Thank you, John. Rebecca?
Sure. I think that, for me, the most important takeaway is that the real shift that generative AI is offering all of us is to accelerate a shift in our teaching and learning approach. And that oftentimes it's not even like brand new ideas of what kids need and skills they need. It's just that we haven't been giving it to them. And so if we can basically do what John Malloy said, like use it as a momentum to really transform education. Of course, we do also need to put guardrails on AI in many different ways, especially around kids and especially around really inappropriate and addictive sort of interfaces. But the big picture for education is sort of, what do you call it? A keto move of like you take some energy and you make it your own to go where you want. I think that's what we should all focus on.
Thank you, Rebecca. And Ellen?
Generative AI and the world of technology, I think, ushers in a different way for us to think about the issues. We've been locked into either or. It's test scores or, I don't know what, loosey-goosey, no accountability. It's content versus skills. It's emotion versus intellect. It's, you know, kids need no nonsense parenting versus they need autonomy. We just have so many false either ors in our world, when I think that we have the knowledge, we have the will, we have the opportunity to bring a change, guided by the question of what kind of kids do we need to leave our world.
Perfect. Thank you. And Rebecca, I'll leave it to you to sign us off.
Fabulous. Well, huge thanks to both Johns. John for moderating, a lively, spirited group of people, not easy. John, Ellen, Mary Helen, thank you all for your time. This was our third in our AI and education series. The next will be on December 9th, I believe at 11 a.m. I can't quite remember. On looking at AI and sort of the purpose of education and meaning making, including mattering at work. And then our January 14th event will be the last in the series, where we launch our AI Task Force reports. So thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you all for being here with us and sharing your time. Take care.